Woman with terminal cancer prays to Jesus for a miracle. What happens in the last medical exam? The winter wind howled outside St. Michael's Hospital, rattling the windows of room 307 where Mary Thompson knelt beside her bed in prayer. Her frail hands clasped together, trembling not from the cold, but from the effort of staying upright. Down the corridor, through the frosted glass, a commotion erupted as a well-dressed couple swept past the waiting area, escorted by Dr. Reynolds himself. Behind them, an elderly woman in a worn coat clutched her chest, watching as they took what should have been her appointment slot. In her room, Mary closed her eyes and whispered, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Through the small window, snowflakes danced in the dim December light, casting ethereal shadows on the linoleum floor. Mary's soft prayers mingled with the steady beep of monitors and the distant sound of footsteps, the rhythm of life and death in a place where miracles and corruption walked the same halls. She didn't see her son David watching from the doorway, his face etched with worry and barely contained anger at what he'd just witnessed in the corridor. Dear friends, before watching this touching story, please take a moment to comment where you're watching from and hit the like button. Your support means the world to us. God bless you all. 28 years ago, on another bitter winter night, Mary Thompson sat alone in her small apartment, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other clutching a letter that would change her life forever. "I can't do this anymore," Thomas had written. The responsibility. It's too much. His wedding ring lay cold on the kitchen table, a final punctuation to their 3 years of marriage. At 8 months pregnant, Mary had already endured whispers at church, judgment from her family who'd warned her about Thomas's wandering eyes and the gradual emptying of their savings account. But nothing had prepared her for abandonment. That night, as snow blanketed Philadelphia in silence, she contemplated ending it all. Then, as if in answer to her darkest thoughts, she felt her baby kick strong and insistent. David, she would name him, after the biblical king who overcame impossible odds. She worked 2 jobs through her pregnancy, mornings at the diner and evenings cleaning offices. Her fellow waitress, Betty, would slip her extra portions, whispering for the little one. When David was born, Mary held him close and made 2 promises: she would never let him feel unwanted, and she would trust in God's plan, no matter how difficult the path. Those early years tested her faith daily. While other mothers at church attended Mommy and Me classes and posted proud photos with their husbands, Mary scrubbed floors and sang hymns to David, carried in a second-hand baby sling. Her own parents, staunch conservatives from rural Pennsylvania, refused to acknowledge their grandson born in sin. Only her younger sister Sarah would secretly send Christmas cards and baby clothes. But Mary found strength in unexpected places. Mrs. Martinez from the apartment below would watch David when shifts ran late. Father Michael from St. Augustine's not only baptized David but helped Mary find better work as a school secretary. Slowly, she built a life centered on faith, hard work, and the fierce love for her son. Through it all, Mary never spoke ill of Thomas to David. When he asked about his father, she would say he wasn't ready for God's greatest gift. She kept everything: the letters, the ring, the wedding photos, locked away in a box for the day David might need answers. Every Sunday she prayed not for Thomas's return, but for his peace wherever he was. As David grew into a thoughtful, intelligent boy, Mary saw him wrestling with the same questions of faith she had faced. He excelled in science, questioning everything, including the biblical stories she held dear. When he announced his acceptance to medical school, her heart swelled with pride and fear: pride in his achievements, fear that he might lose his way in a world that valued proof over belief. Now, as she faced her greatest trial, Mary couldn't help but see God's hand in every step of their journey. Each hardship had strengthened her, preparing her for this moment. What Thomas had meant for abandonment, God had turned into a testimony of endurance and grace. Her only prayer now was that through this illness, David might find his way back to faith. St. Michael's Hospital stood as a stark monument of contradictions. Its gleaming new wing, with private suites and state-of-the-art facilities, overshadowed the aging general ward where Mary now resided. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, chief of oncology, presided over this divided kingdom from his top floor office, its windows overlooking the city's wealthy districts. Below him, Dr. James Anderson fought a daily battle against both disease and bureaucracy. A younger doctor with old-fashioned values, he had taken Mary's case when others deemed it low priority. His colleagues whispered that his dedication to poor patients would cost him his career, but Anderson saw in Mary's eyes the same faith his grandmother had shown through her own cancer battle years ago. David Thompson walked these halls like a man caught between worlds. His white coat and medical degree earned respect from staff, but he couldn't secure better treatment for his own mother. Each morning he watched wealthy patients breeze through to private rooms while his mother waited hours for basic care. His wife, Lisa, once supportive, had grown distant, frustrated by his obsession with exposing the hospital's preferential treatment system. "You can't save everyone, David," she'd say. "There are 3 children sleeping upstairs. We need you too," but how could he focus on soccer games and parent-teacher conferences when his mother lay dying in a hospital that treated healing like a commodity? Mary's room 307 became a gathering place for the hospital's forgotten. Elderly Mr. Johnson from 309 would shuffle in for morning prayers. Sandra, a young mother with lymphoma from 305, sought comfort in Mary's unwavering faith. Even the night janitor, Miguel, would pause during his rounds, drawn by the peace that seemed to radiate from this simple space. But beneath this surface of resilience, the situation grew dire. Mary's cancer had spread aggressively, yet her treatment schedule kept being delayed for priority cases, Dr. Reynolds' signature appeared on all the deferrals, his elegant script declaring death sentences with administrative precision. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. David arrived to find his mother in pain, her medication misplaced during the night shift. As he argued with the nurses' station, he watched Dr. Reynolds escort a local celebrity through the private entrance, bypassing dozens of waiting patients. That same day, Lisa called. "The kids' Christmas pageant is tonight. They need their father there." David stood in the hospital corridor, torn between his dying mother and his living children, between exposing corruption and preserving his career, between the faith he'd abandoned and the science that was failing him. In her bed, Mary saw her son's torment. She remembered another lost man years ago making impossible choices. Unlike Thomas, who had run from responsibility, David was running toward it, even as it threatened to break him. Every night she added a new name to her prayers, Dr. Reynolds, whose soul seemed as sick as any patient's. "Lord," she would whisper, "let my suffering serve your purpose. Let David find his way back to you through this valley of shadows." The crisis erupted on the coldest night of December. Mary's fever spiked to dangerous levels, her fragile body shaking despite the blankets piled upon her. The antiquated heating system in the general ward had failed again, leaving patients huddled in their rooms while the private wing hummed with warmth. "Her white blood cell count is critically low," Dr. Anderson explained to David, his breath visible in the cold air. "She needs immediate intervention," but when they rushed to the treatment room, they found it reserved for a donor's wife. Through the window they watched as the woman received treatment for minor symptoms, while Mary trembled in her wheelchair. Sandra from 305 appeared with a space heater smuggled from home. Mr. Johnson offered his extra blankets. Miguel, the janitor, forgot to lock the door to the staff break room, where David could make his mother tea. This silent rebellion of kindness contrasted sharply with the official indifference upstairs. "We can't wait any longer," Dr. Anderson insisted, confronting the charge nurse. "She needs treatment now." The nurse's eyes darted nervously to Dr. Reynolds' office. "I'm sorry, doctor. All equipment is currently allocated to priority patients." David felt something snap inside him. "Priority patients," his voice carried down the corridor. "You mean rich patients." What happened to do no harm security was called, but not before other waiting families began to murmur in agreement. Later that night, as Mary's condition stabilized thanks to Dr. Anderson's improvised care, David sat by her bed, holding her thin hand. The monitor's beep seemed to mock every principle he'd learned in medical school. Through the window, he watched ambulances arrive with new patients, their fates already determined by the size of their bank accounts. "Mom," he whispered, "how can you still pray for these people?" Mary turned to him, her eyes bright with fever but clear with conviction. "Because once someone showed mercy to us when we needed it most." She told him about the night he was born. No insurance, no husband, no hope. A young doctor had risked his job to admit her, arguing with administration until dawn. "He saw me as a person, not a payment," she said. "That's what medicine should be." The next morning, Dr. Reynolds made his rounds, pausing briefly at Mary's door. Mrs. Thompson, he nodded, not looking up from his chart. We'll try to fit you in next week. Before David could protest, Mary spoke. I'm praying for you, Doctor. Reynolds froze, meeting her gaze for the first time. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or shame. Without a word, he turned and strode away, but his usual confidence seemed shaken. David watched this exchange, remembering his mother's words about Mercy, but as he reviewed her latest test results, Mercy seemed in short supply. The cancer was advancing, time was running out, and the system designed to heal was instead hastening death. Something had to change, and David realized with sudden clarity that he would have to be the one to change it. The evidence appeared like breadcrumbs leading to a darker truth. First came Sarah Mitchell, a night nurse who'd been keeping detailed records of patient prioritization. She found David in the hospital chapel at midnight, clutching a stack of photocopied documents. "Look at these dates," she whispered, spreading papers across the pew. "Every time a wealthy patient makes a donation, a poor patient's treatment gets delayed. Some died waiting." Her hands trembled as she showed a mortality rate significantly higher in the general ward. Through Sarah, David met others, orderlies who'd overheard suspicious conversations, accountants troubled by irregular financial entries, pharmacists pressured to redirect medications. A pattern emerged of systematic discrimination with Dr. Reynolds at its center. "You don't understand what you're getting into," Dr. Anderson warned when David showed him the evidence. "Reynolds has connections in hospital boards across the state. He's untouchable," but Anderson's eyes told a different story. He'd been waiting for someone brave enough to speak up. David began documenting everything. He installed a recording app on his phone, capturing Reynolds's callous dismissals of critical cases. He photographed the stark differences between wards. Most damning were the handwritten notes from Reynolds himself, explicitly linking treatment approval to patients' financial commitment to the hospital's future. The turning point came when David discovered a familiar name in Sarah's records. Thomas Walker, his father, had been treated in the private wing 3 years ago. While Mary struggled to get basic care, the man who abandoned them had received VIP treatment. The date of his death from a car accident matched the hospital records. That night, David confronted his own reflection in the hospital bathroom mirror. His father had died in this very building, probably never knowing his ex-wife lay suffering just floors below. The irony felt like God's dark joke. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Mary later, his voice breaking. She touched his cheek gently. "Because hate destroys the one who carries it, David. I forgave Thomas long ago. That's why I can forgive Dr. Reynolds now." But David wasn't ready for forgiveness. Each time he watched his mother wince in pain, each time another poor patient was turned away, his resolve strengthened. He began building a case, carefully documenting every incident, every violation. Sarah provided access to records. Dr. Anderson quietly connected him with other sympathetic staff. Even Miguel, the janitor, proved invaluable, his invisible presence allowing him to witness damning conversations. Yet as David gathered evidence, he felt increasingly isolated. Lisa's calls went unanswered. His children's drawings piled up unopened on his desk. His mother's faith seemed both an inspiration and a rebuke. How could she maintain such peace while he burned with righteous anger? One evening, as snow fell outside Mary's window, David watched Dr. Reynolds rush another wealthy patient past the waiting room. In his hand, he clutched the flash drive containing all his evidence. The time had come to decide: maintain the comfortable silence or risk everything for justice. His mother's soft prayers filled the room, guiding him toward a choice that would change everything. The breaking point in David's marriage came during the hospital's annual Christmas gala. While he compiled evidence in his mother's room, Lisa attended alone, their children performing in the charity concert he'd promised to watch. His youngest, Emma, had saved him a seat in the front row. "I can't do this anymore," Lisa's voice cracked over the phone that night. "The kids need their father. I need my husband. We're losing you to this." This crusade in the background, he could hear Emma asking why Daddy missed her solo. Mary watched her son's internal struggle deepen. The lines around his eyes grew harder, his faith in humanity eroding with each new discovery of corruption. His white coat, once worn with pride, now felt like a costume in a tragedy. "Remember when you were 10, Mary said one evening, and you wanted to quit Sunday school because Tommy Baker said believing in God was stupid?" David looked up from his laptop, where he'd been documenting another case of treatment discrimination. You said faith isn't about proving others wrong, she continued. It's about living your truth in a way that proves you right. She reached for his hand, her touch still strong despite her weakening body. This fight you're fighting, don't let it steal your soul. But the system seemed designed to steal souls. That week, Sandra from 305 passed away after her treatment was repeatedly delayed. Her daughter came to say goodbye to Mary, clutching her mother's worn Bible. "Mom said to give you this," she whispered. "She said you'd know what to do with it." Inside the Bible, Sandra had documented her own journey through the hospital's corrupt hierarchy. Pages of notes, dates, and desperate prayers created a testament to systemic failure. David added it to his growing evidence, but each new revelation felt like another weight on his conscience. Christmas Eve arrived with bitter winds and fresh snow. The private wing gleamed with decorations while the general ward made do with paper chains crafted by the nurses. Lisa had taken the kids to her parents' house, leaving David with a choice: join his family for Christmas or continue his vigil with Mary. "Go to them," Mary insisted. "Children need their father on Christmas." The words hung heavy between them, echoing Thomas's absence years ago. But David shook his head, remembering countless Christmases when Mary had worked double shifts to give him a holiday worth remembering. That night, as carol singers from the local church visited the ward, David watched his mother join in from her bed, her voice weak but unwavering. "Silent night, holy night," she sang, while down the hall machines beeped their mechanical chorus. Dr. Anderson found David in the chapel after midnight, staring at the nativity scene. "Your wife called the office," he said quietly. "She's worried about you." He placed a hand on David's shoulder. "You can't save everyone by sacrificing yourself." But David thought of Jesus in the manger, of sacrifice and salvation, of his mother's unfailing faith despite a system rigged against her. What if that's exactly what it takes, he asked. Later, scrolling through missed calls and Christmas photos Lisa had sent, David felt the full weight of his choices. Emma in an angel costume, Jimmy reluctantly wearing a shepherd's robe, Sarah as Mary in the pageant, all moments he'd never get back. In her sleep, Mary murmured prayers, her fingers moving over invisible rosary beads. David watched her, remembering how she'd taught him that sometimes the greatest act of faith was simply showing up, day after day, believing things could change. Outside, the Christmas lights reflected off the snow, creating halos around the street lamps. Inside, David made his choice. He would never abandon his family like his father had, but neither could he abandon the fight for justice. The system's facade cracked on New Year's Eve when a prominent senator's daughter received immediate treatment while a janitor's son died waiting in the emergency room. Miguel's anguished cries echoed through the halls as Dr. Reynolds smoothly escorted the senator's family to their private suite. Sarah, the whistleblowing nurse, recorded everything on her phone. "We have enough now," she told David, her hands shaking. "But Reynolds isn't working alone. There's a whole network: board members, administrators, even insurance companies." That same evening, Dr. Anderson received a hand-delivered envelope containing photos of his family, along with thinly veiled threats. "Back off," the note read, "or your daughter's medical school application might face unexpected complications." "They're watching us," Anderson warned David, his normally steady voice trembling. "Reynolds has friends in every major hospital from here to Boston. One word from him could end any medical career." The threat became reality when Sarah was suddenly transferred to the geriatric ward, notorious for its grueling shifts and high staff turnover. Dr. Anderson's research funding mysteriously dried up. Even Miguel found his overtime hours cut. Mary noticed the changes from her bed. "The darkness always fights hardest just before dawn," she said, watching David pace her room. "That's when we most need to hold on to our faith." But faith felt fragile when David discovered the depth of corruption. Patient records altered, deaths classified as natural causes, families pressured into silence with minimal settlements. The private wing's mortality rate was artificially low, while the general ward statistics were buried in bureaucratic paperwork. The revelation that broke David came through Mr. Johnson from 309. Before dying, he confessed that his late wife had been part of the hospital's billing department. She'd left behind a detailed journal of systematic fraud spanning 2 decades. Reynolds hadn't created the system, he'd inherited it, perfected it, profited from it. "Your father knew," Mr. Johnson wheezed. "Thomas tried to expose it 3 years ago. That's why he didn't need to finish." David finally understood his father's fatal accident. That night, Dr. Reynolds made an unexpected visit to Mary's room. Finding David there, he closed the door. "Your father was a fool," he said quietly. "Don't make his mistake. Think about your family." Mary's voice cut through the tension. "I'm praying for you, Richard." She used Reynolds' first name, making him flinch. "I knew your mother. She was a good woman. What would she think of this?" Reynolds' mask slipped for a moment, revealing something like pain. Without another word, he left, but the encounter changed everything. They'd glimpsed the man behind the monster and perhaps his weakness. Through careful investigation, David and Sarah uncovered Reynolds' past. His mother had died in a county hospital, denied treatment she couldn't afford. Instead of fighting the system, he'd joined it, climbing to a position where he'd never be powerless again. The irony wasn't lost on David. Reynolds had become the very thing that destroyed his family, perpetuating a cycle of suffering in the name of protection. As January's harsh winds rattled the hospital windows, David gathered his allies. Sarah with her recordings, Anderson with his patient records, Miguel with his witness conversations, and the growing number of families willing to speak out. "We'll lose everything," Anderson warned. "Our careers may be worse." David looked at his mother, peacefully praying in her hospital bed. "We've already lost something worse," he replied. "Our souls. It's time to get them back." The stage was set for a confrontation that would either break the corrupt system or break them all. In the balance hung not just lives, but the very essence of what medicine was meant to be. Through January's bitter chill, David and his unlikely alliance built their case. Sarah converted the hospital chapel's basement into their secret headquarters, spreading evidence across the altar while keeping watch for Reynolds' supporters. "Look at these patterns," Sarah pointed to a complex web of documents. "Every time a wealthy patient makes a donation, 3 to 4 poor patients get bumped down the list." She'd color-coded 5 years of data, creating a damning timeline of discrimination. The investigation revealed layers of corruption deeper than they'd imagined. Reynolds had created a sophisticated point system. Patients were secretly scored based on wealth, social connections, and potential contribution to the hospital. Those with low scores often died waiting for treatment that never came. Dr. Anderson discovered something even more disturbing. "They're running clinical trials," he whispered one night, showing David a hidden set of files, using poor patients as unofficial test subjects. If something goes wrong, they blame it on delayed treatment or natural causes. Mary's own case appeared in these files, marked with a red flag: potential liability. "Son on staff." Another note, in Reynolds' handwriting: "Red monitor Thompson situation. Contains risk of exposure." The evidence mounted forged consent forms, falsified death certificates, offshore accounts filled with donations. Miguel, cleaning the administrative offices at night, began photographing documents left in plain sight. Board members' names appeared alongside numbers that traced back to Caribbean banks. But the investigation took its toll. Lisa filed for separation, taking the children to her parents' house. "Until you remember what matters most," her note read. David found himself sleeping in his office, surrounded by evidence of corruption, but losing touch with his own humanity. One night, he discovered his mother awake past midnight, praying over a pile of old photographs. "I found them in Sandra's Bible," she explained. "Photos of patients who'd died waiting for treatment, each with a name and date carefully written on the back." "These aren't just cases, David. These are souls." The turning point came when they discovered Thomas's old office computer stored in the hospital's basement. His final emails revealed a pattern of threats leading up to his accident. He'd been preparing to expose everything, working with a journalist from the Philadelphia Inquirer. "Your father wasn't running away," Mary said softly, reading the emails. "He was trying to make things right." The revelation shook David's understanding of his past, of abandonment and redemption. Sarah tracked down the journalist Elizabeth Chin, now working in Boston. Thomas had evidence Chin confirmed via secure email, but everything disappeared after his death. The story died with him. But Thomas had been smarter than Reynolds suspected. Hidden in his old files, encrypted under his son's birthday, they found copies of everything: financial records, patient histories, board meeting minutes documenting explicit decisions to prioritize profit over care. Dr. Anderson's daughter, Rachel, used her computer science skills to decrypt the files. "Dad," she said, eyes wide at the contents, "this goes beyond just one hospital. It's a whole network." The evidence implicated hospital boards across 3 states, insurance companies, pharmaceutical firms, and even state health officials. Reynolds wasn't just a corrupt doctor, he was a node in a vast web of institutional corruption. As they dug deeper, they discovered Mary's cancer treatment had been deliberately mismanaged. They used her to control you, Sarah realized. Keep you distracted, worried, focused on one patient instead of the system. The realization filled David with cold fury, but Mary's response surprised him. Then God is using their evil for good, she said. Through trying to silence us, they've given us the means to speak for those who can't. Their investigation attracted quiet allies. Nurses began slipping them information. Junior doctors shared stories of being pressured to prioritize wealthy patients. Even some board members, troubled by their complicity, made anonymous contributions to their evidence pile. But Reynolds wasn't idle. Staff loyal to him reported suspicious activities. Security cameras mysteriously turned toward the chapel. Sarah's computer was hacked, Anderson's office searched. Miguel questioned about his after-hours cleaning schedule. The pressure mounted when Rachel Anderson's medical school acceptance was suddenly under review. Dr. Anderson found his parking passage spot relocated to a dark corner of the garage. Sarah's nursing license came up for unexpected review. David watched his allies suffer for their conscience and wondered, was this how his father felt? Seeing the rot in the system, knowing the cost of speaking out, but unable to stay silent. Mary observed it all from her hospital bed, becoming a sort of spiritual center for their resistance. People would visit her room to share information but leave with something more valuable: hope, courage, purpose. Evil thrives on isolation, she'd say. But God works through community. Their investigation had become more than an expose, it was becoming a movement for the soul of medicine itself. As January turned to February, they knew they had to act soon. Mary's condition was deteriorating despite Dr. Anderson's best efforts. Reynolds was growing suspicious of their activities. The window of opportunity was closing. One night, as David reviewed their evidence for the 100th time, Mary called him to her bedside. "Remember what matters," she said, taking his hand. "Not revenge, not even justice alone. What matters is healing not just bodies, but the whole system. That's what your father finally understood." David looked at their wall of evidence, hundreds of lives reduced to data points, thousands of decisions that valued wealth over worth. But behind every number was a story, a family, a soul. "We're ready," Sarah announced the next morning, presenting their completed investigation. "But once we start, there's no going back." David thought of Lisa and his children, of his career, of all he might lose. Then he looked at his mother, still praying for those who'd wronged her, and made his decision. "It's time," he said, "not just for Mom or Dad or even us. It's time for every patient who ever died waiting for care they deserved. It's time for medicine to remember its soul." February brought not just snow, but a cascade of personal crises. Lisa served David with divorce papers at the hospital, the manila envelope stark against the white sheets of his mother's bed. "She's hurting too," Mary reminded him, watching his hands shake as he read the legal documents. That evening, David found a box of his children's artwork in his office, delivered by Lisa's sister with a note: "They still ask about you every night." Crayon drawings of their family now showed him standing apart, a stick figure separated by paper distance that felt all too real. Emma's latest picture broke him: a hospital bed with an angel hovering above, and written in childish scrawl, "Daddy helping Grandma get better." She'd drawn him wearing a superhero cape, fighting what looked like a dragon in a doctor's coat. "You're fighting the right battle," Sarah tried to comfort him, finding him staring at the drawing. But maybe not in the right way. She shared how her own marriage had ended during nursing school, her ex-husband unable to understand her dedication to patients over profit. Mary's room became a sanctuary for more than just their investigation. Lisa brought the children for supervised visits, the awkwardness of failed marriage mixing with the beeping of medical monitors. Jimmy, their middle child, refused to hug David, anger at abandonment already taking root. "Remember when you wouldn't speak to Thomas?" Mary asked David one night, after a particularly difficult family visit. "Children see in black and white. It takes time to understand the grays." Through the hospital's thin walls, they could hear other families dealing with their own dramas. The wealthy in private rooms argued over inheritances while the poor pooled resources for basic care. Disease, David realized, wasn't the only thing destroying families. Dr. Anderson's daughter Rachel became a regular visitor, bringing coffee and determination. "Dad used to be like you," she told David, "ready to change the world. Then he learned to work within the system." She paused. "But maybe the system needs breaking to be fixed." One snowy afternoon, Lisa came alone. She found David asleep in the chair by Mary's bed, case files scattered across his lap. For a moment she stood watching him, the man she'd married, the father of her children, the idealist who couldn't let injustice stand. "He's so much like his father," Mary said softly, startling Lisa. "Thomas couldn't ignore wrongdoing either, even when it cost him everything." "Is that supposed to comfort me?" Lisa asked, but there was less anger in her voice than tired resignation. Mary reached for her daughter-in-law's hand. "Love isn't just about happiness, dear. Sometimes it's about supporting someone's fight for what's right, even when it hurts." That night, Lisa called David. While she wouldn't withdraw the divorce papers, she offered to let him see the children more regularly. "They need to understand what you're fighting for," she said. "And so do I." The next day, David found old letters in his mother's bedside drawer, decades of correspondence between Mary and Thomas that she'd never shown him. The last letter, dated just weeks before Thomas's death, revealed a man tortured by his past choices and determined to make amends. "I was a coward when David needed a father," Thomas had written. "But I see now that running from responsibility doesn't free you, it chains you to shame. I have to make this right, even if it costs me everything." David read the letters with trembling hands, his understanding of family and forgiveness shifting like the winter light through the hospital windows. His father hadn't been running from them in those final days, he'd been running toward redemption. Sarah found him in the chapel, letters spread across the pew. "Your mother never told you about these?" she asked, reading over his shoulder. "She was protecting me," David realized. "Like I'm trying to protect my kids by staying away. But what if that's wrong? What if they need to see the fight, not just the victory?" That weekend, David took his children to the hospital's general ward. He showed them not just their grandmother, but other patients' families struggling with both illness and inequality. Emma distributed her drawings to sick children. Jimmy, seeing a boy his age waiting for treatment his family couldn't afford, began to understand. "Is this why you're not home, Daddy?" Sarah, his eldest, asked. "Because you're helping these people." "I'm trying," David answered honestly. "But I haven't been a very good father while doing it." The children's presence changed the ward's atmosphere. Other patients smiled, staff lingered to chat, even Dr. Reynolds seemed disarmed by Emma's innocent questions about why some rooms were bigger than others. Mary watched her grandchildren with joy, though her condition was worsening. "This is what healing looks like," she told David. "Not just medicine, but understanding, love, family." That night, after Lisa picked up the kids, David made a decision. He wouldn't choose between his family and his fight, he'd find a way to unite them. The next morning, he began copying key documents, creating a child-appropriate version of events. Sometimes he'd write to his children years later, "Love means fighting for what's right, even when it's hard. Your grandmother taught me that. Your grandfather died trying to prove it. And I hope you'll understand why I had to continue their fight." As February deepened, David's personal and professional lives no longer seemed like separate battles, but parts of the same war, a fight for justice, for family, for the soul of medicine itself. In Mary's quiet strength, Lisa's grudging understanding, and his children's growing awareness, he found new purpose. "Your father would be proud," Mary whispered one evening, watching him balance case files and Emma's latest drawing. "He'd be proud of all of us." The confrontation erupted on Ash Wednesday, a day when crosses of ash reminded everyone of their mortality. The morning began with Dr. Reynolds announcing budget cuts to the general ward while unveiling plans for a new executive wellness center. David chose this moment to strike. During the board meeting, Sarah live-streamed footage of patients being turned away while empty private suites waited for wealthy clients. Dr. Anderson distributed Thomas's encrypted files to every board member. Miguel wheeled in boxes of evidence, stacking them silently before the stunned administrators. "My father died trying to expose this," David's voice cut through the shocked silence. "How many others died because you valued profits over patients?" Reynolds remained composed until Mary was wheeled into the room. "Tell them about Thomas," she said quietly. "Tell them what really happened that night." The color drained from Reynolds's face. He hadn't expected her to know, hadn't expected anyone to connect the dots. But Mary continued, her voice growing stronger despite her weakness. "You followed him that night, didn't you? After he threatened to expose everything, you watched his car go off that bridge. You could have called for help, but you waited." Security guards shifted uncomfortably as board members began whispering. Reynolds's carefully constructed facade cracked. "He would have destroyed everything we built," he snarled. "The partnerships, the donations, the whole system." "A system built on death," David replied, projecting images of deceased patients onto the boardroom wall. Sandra Williams, age 42, Michael Chen, age 8, Robert Johnson, age 65, all dead because they couldn't pay for priority care. The board chairman tried to call for order, but Sarah was already broadcasting everything live on social media. Outside, reporters gathered as anonymous tips flooded their newsrooms. Inside, decades of corruption unraveled in minutes. Reynolds made one last attempt at control. "You'll never work in medicine again," he threatened. "Any of you, I'll make sure." "Like you did with my father." David stepped closer. "Go ahead, fire us, blacklist us. But explain these first." He dropped a stack of financial records on the table. "Offshore accounts, kickbacks, experimental treatments on uninformed patients. How many laws have you broken, Dr. Reynolds?" The room erupted in chaos. Board members began distancing themselves, some openly condemning Reynolds. Others rushed to call their lawyers. The chairman demanded Reynolds's immediate resignation. But Reynolds had one final card to play. He turned to Mary, his voice dripping with venom. "Mrs. Thompson, your latest tests show your cancer has spread significantly. Without immediate treatment only I can authorize, you won't last a month." The room fell silent. David felt the weight of his mother's life being used as leverage, just as his father's had been. But before he could respond, Mary spoke. "I forgive you," she said simply. "For Thomas. For everything. And I'm still praying for you." Something in Reynolds broke. Years of justified cruelty, of rationalized evil, crumbled before simple grace. He collapsed into a chair, body shaking with suppressed sobs. "I didn't want him to die," he whispered. "I just wanted him to stay quiet. Like everyone else stayed quiet. Like I stayed quiet when my mother died waiting for treatment she couldn't afford." The confession was still broadcasting. Sarah's phone captured every word. Outside, sirens approached the hospital. But Mary wasn't finished. "Then honor her memory," she urged gently, "not by punishing the poor, but by changing the system that failed her." The board chairman, seeing the inevitable, called for an emergency vote. Reynolds was suspended pending investigation. Dr. Anderson was appointed interim chief of oncology. New policies for equal treatment would be implemented immediately. As police entered the boardroom, Reynolds didn't resist. He looked aged, defeated, yet somehow relieved. "I'll need a good lawyer," he said to no one in particular. "I'll pray for you," Mary repeated as security wheeled her out. David watched his mother's greatest victory unfold, not the exposure of corruption, but the transformation of a soul through unconditional forgiveness. Yet even as reporters swarmed the hospital and social media exploded with the scandal, he knew the real battle was just beginning. Reynolds had been right about one thing: Mary's condition was critical. The victory felt hollow as David studied her latest test results. They had changed the system, but would it be in time to save the woman who had inspired the fight? As ash crossed foreheads throughout the hospital that day, reminding everyone from dust you came, to dust you shall return, David held his mother's hand and prayed not for justice anymore, but for a different kind of miracle. The media would call it the biggest healthcare scandal in state history, but in room 307, mother and son simply held each other, understanding that some victories come with devastating costs. The aftermath of Reynolds's arrest brought unexpected healing to St. Michael's Hospital. As federal investigators combed through records, something remarkable began happening in the general ward. Mary's room became the heart of a quiet revolution. Wealthy patients, learning of the corruption, began requesting transfers to the general ward in solidarity. Mrs. Astor, a prominent socialite, moved next door to Mary, declaring, "If this room was good enough for a saint, it's good enough for me." Her presence brought immediate improvements to the entire floor. Lisa arrived that evening with the children, finding David surrounded by reporters. But instead of the angry man she'd separated from, she saw someone transformed. He was explaining to Emma why sometimes grown-ups had to stand up to big dragons even when it was scary. "Like Grandma did?" Emma asked. "Exactly like Grandma did," David smiled, catching Lisa's eye across the room. Something shifted between them, not forgiveness yet, but understanding. That night, as snow fell outside, Mary's condition took an unexpected turn. Her latest tests showed the cancer's progression had slowed significantly. Dr. Anderson couldn't explain it medically, but Sarah had a theory. "Stress feeds cancer," she said. Maybe carrying the weight of silence was as deadly as the disease itself. The hospital chapel, once their secret meeting place, became packed with people praying for Mary. Catholics, Protestants, Jews, Muslims, patients, and staff united in hope. Mr. Goldstein from accounting brought his prayer shawl. Nurse Fatima shared her prayer rug. The interfaith unity would later inspire the hospital's new motto, "All faiths, one healing." David found himself drawn into this spiritual awakening. One evening, kneeling beside his mother, words of prayer came naturally for the first time since childhood. "Thank you," he whispered, "not for justice, but for teaching me mercy." Mary's recovery, while not miraculous by medical standards, defied expectations. Each small improvement felt like a victory. She began sitting up longer, eating better, her eyes bright with purpose. "God's not finished with me yet," she would say, greeting the steady stream of visitors seeking her counsel. From young doctors questioning the ethics of modern medicine to patients struggling with forgiveness, Mary's room became a place of healing for souls as much as bodies. The most profound transformation came when Reynolds' wife visited. Catherine Reynolds arrived one snowy evening, her elegant composure cracking as she faced the woman her husband had wronged. "How can you forgive him?" she asked Mary. "How can anyone?" Mary took her hand. "Because bitterness is a poison we drink ourselves, hoping others will die from it. Your husband lost his way trying to prevent what happened to his mother. Now he has a chance to find it again." That conversation sparked another change. Catherine began working with the hospital board to establish a foundation in her mother-in-law's name, providing care for underserved patients. The system her husband had corrupted would become a model of equitable health care. David watched these changes with amazement, seeing how his mother's simple faith moved mountains that his anger couldn't budge. Lisa noticed too. One evening she brought divorce papers not to file, but to tear up. "The kids were right," she said. "You were fighting a dragon. I just couldn't see it through my fear of losing you." Their reconciliation was quiet, much like Mary's continued recovery. Small steps, tender moments, careful rebuilding of trust. Emma drew a new family picture, all of them together, no more separation, with Mary at the center surrounded by what looked like angel wings. Sarah and Dr. Anderson began dating, their shared battle against corruption blossoming into love. Miguel was promoted to facilities manager, his integrity finally recognized. The hospital staff, freed from Reynolds' regime, rediscovered their calling to heal. But the greatest triumph came during a simple moment in Mary's room. David found his mother sitting up, reading letters from patients whose lives had been touched by her story. "You know," she said, "when I was diagnosed, I asked God why. Now I understand. Sometimes our greatest trials become someone else's healing." David sat beside her, holding her hand like he had so many nights during their darkest hours. "You never stopped believing in miracles," he said. Mary smiled. "The miracle wasn't in the healing, David. It was in the love that grew through the pain. Look at our family now, stronger, closer. Look at this hospital, more compassionate, more just. Even Dr. Reynolds found his way back to his humanity." Outside, spring's first buds appeared on the trees lining the hospital parking lot. Inside, mother and son sat together, watching the sunset paint the room in shades of hope. The battle for St. Michael's soul had been won not through force or exposure alone, but through the quiet power of unwavering faith and unconditional love. In room 307, a different kind of medicine had healed not just bodies but hearts, families, and an entire institution's broken spirit. Mary's unwavering faith and forgiveness deserves a light, yet sadly that small blue button remains untouched. Would you be the first to show your support for this remarkable soul? Let's make her story of hope and healing touch even more hearts. The irony struck like a cruel joke. Dr. Reynolds, awaiting his trial under house arrest, received his own cancer diagnosis. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer, the same disease that had claimed his mother years ago. His wife, Catherine, found him in his study, medical reports scattered across his desk, laughing bitterly at fate's twisted sense of justice. The news reached Mary through hospital whispers. Without hesitation, she asked David to arrange a visit. Some circles need to be broken, she insisted, despite his protests. They found Reynolds a shadow of his former self, already gaunt from chemotherapy. His mansion's opulent furnishings only emphasized his diminished presence. When Mary wheeled into his home office, he couldn't meet her eyes. "I suppose you're here to witness karma," he said quietly. Mary reached for his hand. "I'm here because 30 years ago another woman died alone, thinking no one cared. Your mother deserved better. And so do you." Reynolds broke down, decades of buried grief surfacing. He told them everything, how he'd held his mother's hand in a crowded county hospital watching her die because they couldn't afford better care. How he'd sworn never to be powerless again. How each ethical compromise felt justified until he couldn't recognize himself anymore. "I became what I hated," he whispered. "And now I'm facing the same end." But Mary had other plans. She began visiting regularly, bringing her own brand of healing. While David worked to reform the hospital system, Mary worked on Reynolds' soul. She listened to stories about his mother, shared her own experiences with faith and forgiveness, and most importantly, showed him he wasn't alone. The tragedy deepened when Reynolds' own oncologist recommended prioritizing quality of life over aggressive treatment, the same euphemism he'd used countless times for poor patients. "Now you understand," David said during one visit, his voice tight with complex emotions. "I understood before," Reynolds replied, looking older than his years. "I just convinced myself that playing God was better than feeling helpless." Catherine watched her husband transform through his illness. The arrogant administrator who'd justified corruption became a humble man seeking redemption. He began using his remaining time to document everything, every corrupt decision, every compromised board member, every life his actions had affected. "It won't bring anyone back," he told Mary during one of their talks. "But maybe it can prevent more deaths." The ultimate irony came when his insurance company, one he'd collaborated with for years, denied coverage for an experimental treatment. The very system he'd helped build now turned against him. Mary organized prayer circles for him. The same people who'd once cursed his name now asking God for mercy. Some called it divine justice, others a tragedy, but Mary saw it differently. "Every illness is an opportunity," she told him, "not just for healing the body, but for healing the soul." Reynolds spent his remaining time making amends in whatever ways he could, learning from Mary that true power lay not in controlling life and death, but in facing both with dignity and grace. The worst blizzard in Philadelphia's history struck 1 week after Reynolds' diagnosis. St. Michael's Hospital, still reeling from scandal, faced a new crisis as power lines collapsed under thick ice. The backup generators in the renovated private wing hummed steadily, but the aging system serving the general ward sputtered ominously. "We have maybe 6 hours of emergency power," Dr. Anderson announced in the dimly lit corridor. "And the roads are impassable for evacuations." The cruel symmetry wasn't lost on anyone. The same system that had privileged the wealthy now literally kept their lights on while others faced darkness. But this time something was different. Mrs. Astor, still in her solidarity room next to Mary, immediately offered to share her wing's power supply. Other private patients followed suit, creating a chain of extension cords and shared resources that broke down the hospital's physical divisions as surely as Mary had broken down its spiritual ones. But nature proved merciless. By midnight, temperatures in the general ward plummeted. Nurses distributed extra blankets, but patients with critical care needs faced growing danger. The monitors in Mary's room began failing one by one. David found himself facing an impossible choice. The private wing had enough backup power to sustain either the general ward's critical care equipment or its heating system, but not both. Heat would keep more patients comfortable, but the equipment failures would certainly cost lives. "Save the others," Mary whispered, her breath visible in the cold air. "Warmth won't matter if their machines fail." Through the night, staff and able patients huddled together for warmth. Miguel organized a brigade to carry hot drinks from the still-functioning private wing kitchen. Sarah coordinated a rotation system, moving the most vulnerable patients to warmer areas in shifts. The scene in Mary's room captured the crisis in microcosm. She insisted on sharing her blankets with others, even as her own lips turned blue. Dr. Anderson monitored her vitals manually after her machines died, his fingers nearly numb from cold. Outside, the wind howled like a hungry beast, rattling windows and driving snow into drifts that sealed every exit. Inside, darkness crept through corridors where extension cords couldn't reach. Some patients began singing hymns to keep their spirits up, their voices carrying through the gloom. The night seemed endless. David moved between patients, making impossible decisions about resource allocation, haunted by how similar he felt to Reynolds in that moment, playing God, choosing who would suffer less. But unlike Reynolds' era of secret decisions, every choice now was made openly, with patients and staff working together to protect the most vulnerable. When a young mother's ventilator began failing, 3 other patients volunteered to share their power supply. In Mary's room, the temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Ice crystals formed on the windows, creating delicate patterns that caught what little light remained. Through chattering teeth, she continued praying not for herself, but for everyone in the hospital's care. As the night deepened and hope seemed to freeze along with everything else, no one could predict how this crisis would reshape St. Michael's once again, or who would survive to see the dawn. The hidden truths emerged like ice thawing in spring. As Reynolds lay dying in his mansion, he summoned David for one final confession. The connection between Reynolds and Thomas ran deeper than anyone suspected. They had been residents together, idealistic young doctors sharing dreams of reforming healthcare. But when Reynolds' mother died, their paths diverged dramatically. Thomas chose to fight the system while Reynolds decided to master it. Their friendship shattered when Thomas discovered Reynolds' first compromises, small ethical breaches that would eventually grow into systematic corruption. The night of Thomas's death held more complexity than simple murder. Reynolds revealed how Thomas had confronted him with evidence of patient exploitation, threatening to expose everything. Their argument had turned physical, with Thomas fleeing in his car. Reynolds followed, not to kill, but to plead for silence. When Thomas's car spun out on the icy bridge, Reynolds had frozen. The crucial minutes he waited before calling emergency services sealed Thomas's fate. But the deepest revelation struck David like a physical blow. Thomas had written a letter to Mary the day he died, entrusting it to Reynolds. A letter explaining everything, begging forgiveness and revealing his plan to make things right. Reynolds had kept it all these years, his last piece of leverage now rendered meaningless by his own mortality. With trembling hands, he gave David the unopened envelope, its edges yellowed with age. Mary read her husband's last words with tears streaming down her face. "I left to protect you both," Thomas had written. Reynolds threatened to destroy any chance of David's medical career if I exposed him. "I couldn't let my mistakes cost our son his dreams. Please understand, I'm not running away this time. I'm finally standing up for what's right." The truth shifted everything David had believed about his father, about abandonment, about the true meaning of sacrifice. The man he'd spent years hating had died trying to protect his future. Reynolds watched the realization dawn on David's face. "Your father was the better man," he whispered. "He never stopped fighting for what was right." "I just stopped believing anything could be right in a broken system." In those final moments, Reynolds offered one last revelation: a network of offshore accounts holding millions in stolen hospital funds. "Use it," he gasped, pressing a USB drive into David's hand. "Do what your father died trying to do. Fix what I helped break." The weight of truth settled over the room like fresh snow, beautiful and terrible in its purity. The path to redemption unfolded in unexpected ways during Reynolds' final weeks. From his deathbed, he orchestrated a complete transformation of St. Michael's Hospital through a series of carefully planned revelations and actions. First came the public confession, broadcasted live from his home, detailing decades of corruption while accepting full responsibility. But instead of destroying the hospital's reputation, his honesty sparked a nationwide dialogue about healthcare inequality. His testimony before the state medical board, delivered via video as cancer ravaged his body, became a powerful catalyst for systemic change. Reynolds converted his mansion into a charitable foundation, establishing a fund for underprivileged patients. He worked tirelessly with David and Dr. Anderson, using his intimate knowledge of the corrupt system to dismantle it piece by piece. The most profound change came through Mary's influence. Her regular visits transformed Reynolds from a bitter, dying man into someone seeking genuine redemption. Their conversations, witnessed by increasingly amazed hospital staff, demonstrated the power of forgiveness to heal not just individuals but institutions. Under Mary's guidance, Reynolds reached out to families he had wronged, offering not just compensation but heartfelt apologies. He spent hours with young doctors, sharing cautionary tales about how small ethical compromises can lead to devastating moral failures. The hospital board, guided by Reynolds' insights and David's vision, implemented revolutionary changes. Private rooms were reallocated based on medical need rather than wealth. A new ethics committee, including former patients like Mary, gained oversight of all major medical decisions. The transformation extended beyond policy changes. Reynolds' public struggle with cancer, faced with dignity and transparency, became a powerful symbol of the very equality he had once subverted. When his own insurance denied coverage for experimental treatment, he turned the rejection into an opportunity to fight for universal access to care. In his final days, Reynolds found peace not in the wealth and power he'd accumulated, but in using his remaining time to dismantle the very systems he'd helped build. His death would come not as a tragedy, but as a testament to the possibility of change, even in life's final chapters. Mary sat with him in those last hours, their quiet conversations healing wounds that had festered for decades. Sometimes she told him, God's greatest miracles aren't in healing the body, but in healing the heart. Reynolds' last words to David were not of regret, but of hope. Your father died trying to change the system from the outside. I lived long enough to help change it from within. Together we finally got it right. The transformation of St. Michael's Hospital bloomed like spring flowers breaking through winter frost. 1 year after Reynolds' death, the hospital had become a model of equitable health care that drew attention from medical institutions nationwide. The Reynolds Foundation, managed jointly by Catherine and David, revolutionized patient care through innovative funding programs. Mary's recovery, while not the instantaneous miracle some had prayed for, progressed steadily. Her presence in the hospital evolved from patient to informal chaplain, her room becoming a sanctuary where healing transcended the physical. David's reputation, far from being destroyed as Reynolds had once threatened, grew as he implemented reforms that balanced medical excellence with compassionate care. His published papers on ethical healthcare transformation were adopted into medical school curricula across the country. Lisa and the children moved back home, their family stronger for having weathered the storm together. Emma's drawings of hospital angels now decorated the pediatric ward, while Jimmy proudly told his classmates how his dad fought the dragon and won. The hospital chapel, once their secret meeting place, became a bustling center for both prayer and practical support, hosting support groups and counseling sessions. Sarah and Dr. Anderson married there, with Mary insisting on attending despite her weakened condition. The ceremony unified the hospital staff in a way no policy ever could. Miguel's promotion to facilities director symbolized the institution's commitment to recognizing integrity over influence. He established a scholarship program for custodial staff's children, named in honor of Thomas Thompson. Perhaps most remarkably, former private wing patients continued choosing to stay in the general ward, breaking down the last vestiges of medical segregation. Mrs. Astor became a regular volunteer, using her social connections to raise funds for the hospital's new equality initiatives. The waiting rooms, once divided by invisible lines of privilege, became places where CEOs sat beside construction workers, all receiving the same standard of care. Mary watched these changes from her room, her prayers now filled more with thanksgiving than petition. Sometimes she often said, God answers prayers in ways we never expected. He didn't just heal my cancer, he healed an entire hospital's heart. The final chapter of St. Michael's transformation unfolded during the following Christmas season. Mary, now strong enough to move about in a wheelchair, presided over a special ceremony in the hospital's newly renovated central garden. The space, once reserved for private wing patients, had been transformed into a healing garden open to all, featuring a memorial fountain dedicated to those who had died waiting for care. David stood beside his mother, watching as hundreds of people gathered, patients, staff, community members, and families of those lost to the old system. Snow fell gently as Mary cut the ribbon, her voice clear and strong as she led the assembly in prayer. The garden centerpiece, a bronze sculpture showing hands lifting a broken heart toward heaven, bore a plaque with Thomas's final words, "Love demands courage to change what we cannot accept." Catherine Reynolds unveiled her final contribution, a massive endowment ensuring the hospital would always provide care regardless of ability to pay. In a surprising gesture, she also revealed that her husband's personal fortune had been used to establish a whistleblower protection fund for medical professionals who exposed corruption. Lisa, fully reconciled with David, had taken charge of the hospital's new family support program, turning their personal struggles into a source of help for others facing similar challenges. Their children became regular fixtures in the pediatric ward, with Emma's art therapy program helping young patients express their fears and hopes. The hospital's transformation caught national attention, spawning a movement for healthcare reform. Other institutions began adopting the St. Michael's model, prioritizing equitable care while maintaining financial stability. Mary's story, published in medical journals and featured in national media, became a catalyst for change across the country. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the confrontation that had exposed Reynolds' corruption, Mary led a candlelight vigil in the garden. Patients and staff, rich and poor, believers and skeptics, all joined hands in the falling snow as they sang Silent Night. Mary looked at her son, the boy she'd raised alone, the man who'd risked everything for justice, the doctor who'd helped heal not just bodies but the soul of medicine itself. In that moment, surrounded by the community they'd helped build, both mother and son understood that sometimes the greatest miracles aren't in the healing we pray for, but in how we help others heal along the way. The light from hundreds of candles reflected off the falling snow, creating a glow that seemed to promise that even in the darkest winter, hope never truly dies. Dear friends, if Mary's story of faith, forgiveness, and miraculous healing touched your heart, please take a moment to support our team by hitting that subscribe button and sharing this video with your loved ones. Your likes and comments mean everything to us. We'd love to hear how this story moved you and what moments touched you the most. Should we continue Mary and David's journey in part 2? Let us know in the comments below. Together we can spread this message of hope and healing to those who need it most. God bless you all.